Welcome to Sencillo y Directo, Simple and Direct, a podcast by CESDP with music by Ivan Lucero. I'm your co-host, Adrian Sandoval, together with
Elena Valdez, part of CESDP's leadership team. And this is a podcast dedicated to topics you only share in the corners of your offices, at home, among your closest friends, or even... I don't know.
In the alley.
In the alley. Going to the topic of George Sanchez's Forgotten People, published in 1940, that actually speaks to many of the issues we continue to see today in education in New Mexico. What got us started on this topic, Adrian? To begin with, do you recall?
You know, I believe it was a lot of the realities that we encounter daily in our work and perhaps even in our private lives, our personal lives, right? That speak to the notion of Martinez Yazzie.
But let's back up, because really what inspired this conversation was W.E.B. Du Bois and that PBS special. And I had asked you if you'd watched it, and you said no.
Right, no, and I saw how animated you were, and what you mentioned to me is that it really speaks to and parallels with and gives almost like a foundational opportunity to really think about what were some of the things that may have inspired the dialogue and the positionality of some of the members of our community who were speaking in similar ways back in the 40s in this case.
When I think we were kind of like deliberating a little bit who would be the Nuevo Mexicano Du Bois, and I automatically thought of George I. Sánchez, born in Barelas, got an undergraduate degree from UNM, then went off to institutions outside of the state, I think to UT, Austin, and then Berkeley, and then had a career as a professor in Texas. I understand. I'm a little embarrassed to say that I even now do not know very much about George Sánchez, even though my background is in Latino studies and Mexican American literature, and I pride myself in how much I know about Nuevo Mexicano history, but I don't know a lot about him.
No, I think that really speaks to the rationale of your choice, and actually for me, kind of like a criticism that I can put out there on behalf of the communities to which we belong within the United States, right? And that is that how wonderful that we're familiar with Du Bois, but when it comes to individuals, and in particular the title of this book by George Sánchez, Forgotten People, that in many ways no one knows anything about George I. Sánchez. And yet some people can speak very directly to Du Bois and his platform and his efforts at advocacy, his brilliance, his philosophy, et cetera, but no one knows about George I. Sánchez.
Yeah, and I don't want to suggest that they're totally equivalent, because obviously Du Bois had a very unique life and the kind of activism he participated in, the very kind of influential avenues that he took in his own sociological studies. Like, it was all very groundbreaking, the work he did. But go ahead.
Yeah, no, but even in New Mexico, as no Mexicanos, right? No Mexicanas, we don't know anything, right? Yeah. And to be honest with you, my intersection with George I. Sánchez is with the lifelong, I believe there's a lifelong recognition that's given by the Association of Bilingual Education of New Mexico for individuals in bilingual education, and it's the George I. Sánchez Award. And for us to now begin to pull apart, to look at the various pieces of this particular individual, begins to uplift perhaps a life and a voice that few of us are aware of.
Yeah, so I guess a month ago or 2 months ago, I went to the Latino Studies conference in Austin, and what kind of reminded me about this individual was that there's a big building named after him in, of all places, Austin. And again, how interesting that here in New Mexico, we don't think of him often. Although there is one elementary school in Albuquerque named after him, right?
Yes.
Too, yeah.
They're on the west side, I believe.
Yeah. So I had Adrian read the preface to Forgotten People and the chapter on education. Given our work that we do at CESDP, obviously it's extremely relevant, as Adrian said, in terms of Yazi Martinez. But kind of as I was rereading Forgotten People, I kept in mind Du Bois and the idea, the question that he asked in The Souls of Black Folk. How does it feel to be a problem? And I feel like George Sánchez was similarly articulating or voicing that kind of question as it related to Nuevo Mexicanos in the early 20th century.
Correct. And I believe that a parallel, I guess, comment or question would be, how does it feel to be forgotten in your very own state, in your very own economy, in your own lands, within your own culture? That's profound. Within your own education.
George Sánchez is talking about, in many ways, how the Nuevo Mexicanos, who comprise 96% of the school-age population in Taos County specifically. In this chapter, he focuses on Taos County, something like that, the 90%, that so much of who these children are, their language, right, their culture, their associations with the environment around them is not welcomed, included in their school spaces.
Right. Before I respond to that, I just want to pull back a little bit and just give for the audience a little bit of like a perspective of that particular time in the 20th century, where George alludes to the fact that as they're entering the last half of the 20th century, they're really moving in and through an era of unprecedented change. And lo and behold, we're experiencing something very similar at the moment. Change, transformation around our society as a whole. And even the backlash of what that change creates within society, which is a push towards what was known, what was familiar at one time, which I think in many ways harkens back to that time in the first half of the 20th century. And here we find ourselves in the 21st century, really still reckoning with those idealistic points of view about what life was like through a conservative lens in years gone by, and how that continues to affect who we are and the interactions that we have within public schools.
I wanted to ask you, given what you just said, before we even go further into George Sánchez, but this world that he writes about, this is our grandparents, right, Adrian? And
yes, our grandparents, our great-grandparents. I felt like he was alluding to both, because in many ways, when he was starting to speak about some of the types of schooling that were provided, that I think in many ways began to ostracize our prior generations even more, was this notion that, well, let's teach them specific trades without even forethought about how those trades could be marketed, or what socioeconomic level does this or freedom do those trades provide these individuals, these communities, and the future generations that depend on them in this newly embraced, newly forced upon reality of consumerism and of capitalistic practices. So again, there was that shift from really a communal approach to exchanging, to the cambalache, right, the exchange of goods that our great-grandparents knew, and perhaps our parents and our grandparents knew very well. In exchange for this, I'll get this, And in many ways, that still happens for us as no Mexicanos. That just the reality of, okay, let's transition to a different form of an economy. And really, I think what was done was our grandparents and our great grandparents and even our parents in some instances, depending on where they were living, were set up to fail in the economy of the middle of the 20th century.
It felt like at the same time he was arguing that there's a place for the ways Nuevo Mexicanos have lived in the world. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the conclusion at the end of the book was really a recognition that the schooling that our grandparents and great grandparents, if our great grandparents had access to it, the schooling they received, and even our parents, I'm looking at those three generations, because through this small reading, I begin to have even a deeper understanding of the level of depression that our great grandparents expressed. And how that depression influenced the following generation, where some of our grandparents were willing to say and do, place into action the notion of completely forgetting who we were linguistically and culturally for the purposes of excelling within this new society. That was English-based, that was focused on consumerism, et cetera, et cetera. And how, in many instances, that generation and the generation that followed turned to self-medication, whether through alcoholism or other things, to kind of process and get through that disenfranchisement that occurred in society, in education, in access to the economy, to be able to provide for their children in ways that were equitable to other communities in the state and beyond. And so I found that fascinating. And I think getting back to kind of like the conclusion for me that was expressed by George was this idea that what was really occurring in public schools was really a highly focused effort at assimilation, and assimilation with an exchange of the lowest levels of minimal levels of education and of training in order to occupy some of the lower levels of the socioeconomic ladder. What kind of stood out was this idea of recognizing that Mexicanos were very agrarian based, including our indigenous family, right? Our indigenous families, our indigenous communities. And I deliberately elevate that to that reality. I think that's kind of spoken to, kind of alluded to. And maybe it was just me in my mind, but being agrarian based and yet no specific effort at uplifting that and doing it in a way where it would still, I think there was a statement in there where there were individual families that at one point were able to provide and more for their children. But as the transition economically to the realities of what we have embraced for the past 100 years or so came into play, that these individuals now were not able to provide. And why? Because they were duped in to believing that their land had no value, their practices had no value, their culture had no value, their language had no value. And yet there were efforts to subsidize and support other Latin American countries without recognizing the Latin American reality in their own backyard of the United States, and valuing those things and uplifting those things. And I think that it really speaks to the notion of why George, I feel, was being very critical as well of the United States and their efforts at their minimal, trivial efforts at educating our grandparents and our great grandparents and our parents.
Yeah, so you touched on something that I feel like is pretty underexplored, and that's the relationship between loss of land and that relationship to education and everything that with the loss of land, right? You lose touch with language, you lose touch with culture, and you lose your ability to sustain yourselves, literally, right? Because you cannot grow the food, you cannot keep the sheep that you were once able to keep, you cannot keep the cows because you just don't have access anymore.
And hence the trauma and the depression and the unraveling of culture and family. That, and it's not to say everything was beautiful and wonderful at one time. We all know that things are never perfect. But I'm talking about a broader, full community that's all of the state, that expands throughout the Southwest, that we are still trying to heal from, and still trying to develop voice around, and still trying to advocate around. And strangely enough, the very institutions that created this are trying to find solutions. And of all things, they continue to look outward instead of inward for conversation, for forgiveness, for resolution, for direction.
Do you think that George Sánchez misses the mark on anything in this chapter?
I found very strange. I'm so glad you asked that, Elena, because I think you've already alluded to this. The style, and I don't know if the style was of the time, but I found it so interesting how George would start off a perspective, right, a position, by kind of uplifting things and then deconstructing them. I felt like that was a waste of time. And so I found it kind of strange. I was wondering why he approached it in that way, and I didn't know if it was a question of the time and style of the time, or if it was a combination of things, almost kind of deviously uplifting what the institution was attempting to do, and then pulling back the curtain to say, well, it hasn't been successful. I don't know. Maybe it was the time that I read it, and maybe I'm misinterpreting it. Maybe that requires me going back. But I really felt, I thought that was kind of awkward. And so was he off the mark? I think there were instances where I kind of, there were moments such as what I'm describing where I was questioning in my mind, wait a minute, what position are you taking? And then as I kept reading, I think there were instances where I felt that as an author, this person was able to absolve himself of the questions that I had.
If you go to the preface, which was written with a publication of Forgotten People in 1967, so 27 years later, almost 30 years later, he's writing, he says that he's not as optimistic as he once was because little had changed. And I feel like this was right on the right before or during, this would have been published, the Tierra Maria courthouse raid, right? So all of this is happening at the same time, which is, I think, a topic for another podcast episode. Before our time ends, I wanted to ask you one last question. What do we need to do so we don't remain the forgotten people?
I think what we're attempting here, and other things that we have planned that maybe slowly but surely we'll begin to share with the listening public, is just really uplifting the voice of the forgotten people. Sharing space, creating space to collectively express the narrative of both reflection and an eye towards the future, the now, the future, and for generations that come. So that way we very clearly are stepping on our soapbox and delineating, expressing, voicing, shouting what it is and who we are as people in New Mexico and where we want to go, and articulating that in a variety of fashions. So again, Getting back to your question, uplifting that voice, creating a space for that voice, because we don't want that voice to be forgotten.
Thank you, Adrian.
Thank you, Elena.
Thank you, everyone, for listening.
Thank you from all of us here at Sencillo y Directo. Hasta pronto.